Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to use a sort of Martian scene. So I'm not going to worry too much about the spaceship and the habitat in there, but we'll just cover how to create these rocks, how to create the landscape, how to distribute different sizes of rocks around the landscape, and how to create a sort of foggy, dusty wind effect. You may just be able to make out that there's a variation in the volumetric effect of the fog or mist or sand in the air in here, and that's one of the main things I want to really show how to do. It's very straightforward and it seems to work quite well, particularly now that there's been improvements to cycles. So to begin with, we need to make our landscape, and I made two landscapes. I made one that I set at some distance and one that was obviously much closer to the camera. So first of all, go to Preferences and make sure that you've enabled the ANT landscape generator. Just make sure that box is ticked under Preferences, add-ons. And then we can just add under mesh a landscape. So be careful not to modify it in any way until you're happy with it, because there's a little box here we can call that allows us to change various settings. So you can change the noise size here. I'm going to add a subdivision surface on it afterward anyways, which will smooth it out. And you can change the seed here, which will keep giving you different options based on the current setup, and you can use a variety of different options in here that will give you various different landscapes depending on what you're trying to achieve. So I'll go with that one, and then we'll just try a few different seeds. It's nice to have a variation, and I'm just going to shrink the noise size in a little bit there, and we can even go for more subdivisions. So I've changed the subdivisions to 256 there, which gives me more detail. Is obviously going to create more geometry. So we've got 65,000 vertices here. This is going to be a significant part of the scene, and if I put the mesh size up, you can see what it does. So the whole thing is bigger, but we've still got the same settings. So you may need to adjust the noise there. You can see if you go to very small noise, it's not what you want at all really. So we'll go with that for now, and I want it quite a bit bigger, so I'm just going to scale it up. If I look through my camera now, you can see it's a bit high for my camera, and I'm just going to move it off into the distance somewhat, and then I'm going to rotate it to get a more interesting look. It doesn't matter if I can see the bottom edge here, as long as I can't see the corners. And we'll just give it a basic material, we'll call that distant ground, and give it a slightly orangey look, darken it a little, and I'll give it that colour in the viewport. And I should say this is going to be a cycles tutorial, but most of this would apply in EV as well. So there's my camera, there's my landscape. I'm going to move it back slightly further and scale it up a little bit. And now I'm going to add plane, scale that up, particularly on the X, and raise it up a little so that it's above the height of the edge of the distant landscape. And then we'll go into edit mode, right click and say subdivide, and I'll put a couple of subdivisions on, and then I will start to increase fractal, which will give me some lumps and bumps in the landscape. And then right click again and say subdivide again, and put some more fractal on, and I'll increase it again there. And I'm going to scale it on the Y a little as well, I think. And then we'll say shade smooth, and we'll say that on both of them. And I'm going to put a subdivision surface on there. I've only done it at level 1 for the moment. We'll give that a ground material, but we'll call this near ground. They're both the same at them. So the general idea is I can differentiate between the two. I don't have to have exactly the same settings on both of them, which means I can manage the amount of geometry in the scene. So next I need to create some rocks so that I can distribute them. So I'll put my pointer over here and make sure under Preferences we've got the rock generator enabled. Add mesh rocks, that tells you where it's going to be. So under mesh, see we've now got the rock generator. So a lot of choices available in here. Bear in mind we're going to add quite a few of these, but I'm going to add two different types of rock. I'm going to add high detail rocks and low detail rocks. Obviously there'll be a lot less of the high detail rocks. The low detail ones will be almost gravel. So you can play with detail level here, we can play with roughness here, and we can tell it how many we want. So I'm going to add half a dozen rocks and just playing around with them a little bit. It looks odd to start with because they're all created one on top of the other. Put a bit of smoothness on them, and I'll increase the display detail level a little. So once you've done that, best to separate the rocks so you can see them. There's our 6 rocks. They look quite good. And now I'm going to turn those into a new collection. So press M, and we'll call this large rocks. We'll give them a new material which we'll call L rocks. we'll just make this fairly dark material at the moment. I noticed that a lot of rocks on some of the pictures of Mars I've seen recently are a very different colour to the sand. They're often very, very dark for some reason, some interaction between UV and the chemistry of the rocks, I imagine, over a very long period of time. So I've created that material on the one rock. So if I now select each of the others, holding shift down and select that one last, and then click in here and just say copy material to selected, they've all got that material. And while we're here, let's create the small rocks as well. We probably don't need that many because the detail on these is going to be very low, but I'm not going to worry too much. So let's turn the detail level down. Let's try 2. The actual size of them doesn't really matter because that's going to be controlled by the geometry system. So we'll make another new collection, which is small rocks, and then we'll copy that material over to those. And it doesn't really matter at the moment whether I use the large rock material or not, but we've got our 2 collections of rocks. Now we're ready to start building the geometry node system. So when I did this several years ago, obviously I used a hair particle system. I'm forcing myself to keep using the geometry nodes because ultimately, although they're a little harder to use than the old particle systems, in some respects, they do have more capability, and hopefully things will get easier as it evolves. So let's open another window and we'll go to the geometry node editor and we'll say new. If I open modifiers, you can see as well as the subdivision I already had on there, that's now added a geometry node system. If I break that link, you can see my object disappears. It's still there, but it's not being output, as it were. One of the first nodes I typically add under geometry is a join geometry node. If I put that there, so that means I can take geometry off here and do things with it and still have the original geometry being output. You don't always want that, but in this case we do. So now I'm going to add under points a distribute points on faces node. I'm also going to add under instances an instance on points node. Join those two together so the points output of distribute points on faces goes into the points input on instance on points, and then the output just gets joined with our geometry. Nothing's changed yet, and I need to take my original geometry, which has got the original points that I'm playing with, and put it into here, and still nothing's happened yet. It's going. So over here I've got my large rocks. Just left mouse and hold that and drag that into here, and you can see we get a collection info node for my large rocks collection. Click separate children and reset children. That's quite important, otherwise you do get some problem. And then take the geometry output and put that into instance. You can see our geometry is now covered in rocks. Before we go any further, although we're going to control this in other ways, I'm just going to scale those down so they're not completely covering our surface. And you can see it's actually, you may just be able to make out that it's all of our rocks at the moment. So we'll click pick instance, and now it isn't all of our rocks. They're all rotated in one direction, but we're getting individual rocks now. But in order to properly control how they're selected, we need to do a little bit more. So I'm now going to add, under utilities, a random value node. So literally it's going to produce a random number. It only needs to be integers for what I'm going to use it for, which is to control the instance index. Each of those rocks, when they were created, will be assigned a number, and obviously they are whole numbers or integers. So we need to be able to randomly select each one of those rocks. So I've created this random value node here, and I just need a big number in here. It doesn't really matter what, probably 5 or 6 would do, but any big number, and I'm quite happy to use that. Then take that and put that into the instance index, and that should make sure that we're randomly selecting different rocks. If you just play with this number, you can see we've got different rocks appearing. I'm now going to copy that random value node and change this to vector. I'm going to leave the minimum at 0 and the maximum I'm going to set to 360 for each X, Y and Z. And then I'm going to feed that into rotation. I believe this rotation number isn't in degrees, so we'll just need to put a large number in. Again, it doesn't really matter what, we're just creating random numbers. And if necessary, there is a node to convert this to degrees, as it were, and we can play around with all sorts of things in here. You can see they're not quite rotating as you might expect, and that's just because it's probably using Euler rotation. So you can see that's starting to give us a load of rocks. They're all the same size at the moment, so you would think the simple thing to do would be to do exactly the same with scale, and there's a scale input here, as we did with rotation. However, if you do that, so if I put the max scale up to 1 and the min scale to 0.1, what you'll tend to get is Well, apart from that, we've obviously got some very big rocks there, so I'm going to go for a max scale of 0.25. But you can see you also get very, very flat rocks and things like that. You might want that, but if you want the whole rock to change in size rather than its proportions, just change this to float. And float will work even though this is a vector input, but it will take whatever number is being generated and apply that to both X, Y and Z. You don't need to have a vector and then rejoin them or anything silly like that. So now I can control the max size of my rocks very easily, something like that, and I'll obviously put the min size up to something other than 0. So we've got some nice big rocks and some smaller rocks, but we aren't controlling the distribution of those rocks in any way at the moment. So let's do that. So I'm now going to add under texture a Voronoi texture. I'm going to add under color a color ramp and take the distance output of my Voronoi texture into the color ramp, and I'm just going to drag the points in somewhere like that. Leave it on linear for the moment. I'm going to add under utilities a map range node. So this allows us to take a value which, for example, goes between 0 and 1 and rescale it to some other value. So I'm going to take the color output and put that into the value, and I know this will be between 0 and 1 because this is how these nodes work, and I changed it such that it was between 0 and 0.1. It's just rescaled it really. I could have just multiplied it by a small number as well, and then I'll apply that to the density. Now this density number, if I turn that down, you can see the number of rocks is reducing. So this is going to control with a pattern how many rocks in any given area there are. So let's take the output of that and put it into the density input, and we just need to play around with this rescale value, and you can see this is now giving us a distribution of rocks that isn't everywhere. It's not even everywhere. The actual distribution we can play with the seed. So it's, I guess, an additional randomness. So we have some clear areas of rocks as well as more dense area, and how it's interpreted we can adjust here. And the scale here, obviously. It should be more obvious when I do the same with the smaller rocks. But you can see we've almost got a line of larger rocks running through there. So I could now put a box around all of this, duplicate it and then make some changes to make the small rocks, but I decided just to keep it all in one net. So I'm going to select all of these nodes and just duplicate them, and I'll put them here for now. Before I connect them, let's just zoom in and make a couple of changes. So this time we want the small rocks. Now I'm going to just move that over here, the output of that into the join geometry node, and I need to take the input here into the same place on this distribute points on faces node. So let me just take it over there and then I'll zoom in so you can see it. So there. Now at the moment they're both doing the same thing, albeit one's using the lower resolution models. So if I change the seed, and particularly the scale of the Voronoi, you can see things are moving around a bit. So let's make them quite a bit smaller. So let's go to 0.001.1. Now let's see if we can turn the density of the rocks up quite a lot. So you can see there's a lot more rocks appearing. We can probably make them even smaller than that. So we'll go for 0.01, maybe 0.025, and now I'll turn up the numbers of rocks quite a lot, and then we can play with our pattern here. You can see how that Voronoi texture is affecting them, and I use the Voronoi for both of them, but I play around with the color ramp, and you can see there are gaps, which is what I want really. I don't want a completely even spread of small rocks all over the place, but then I can add a few more. So let's have a look at what that's starting to look like. So now you can see we've got a pleasing set of where we've got little rocks and then areas where we've got none at all. And I'm just going to turn down the max size even a little bit more. So that's good. For the rock distribution, that's it. I didn't want to do a major geometry nodes tutorial this time. There's quite a few nodes there, but you can see this is just a repeat of this. You could box this up, as I said. But we need some rocks on our distant landscape, but obviously we wouldn't really see the very small rocks. So if we select our distant landscape, we can just say new and then select our existing geometry nodes, and that's now got the same distribution. However, that landscape is supposed to be a lot further away than it really is. So one of the things I'm going to do is click this little 2 here to make this set of geometry nodes unique, and I'll say geo rocks distant, so we know which one we're dealing with. I'm going to then just take away all of those small rocks. We don't need those at all. And then I'm going to make those big rocks quite a bit smaller. So we'll go for 0.005 as the smallest size, and the biggest size, let's try 0.05, because they are supposed to be a similar size to these rocks, but obviously much further away. And because they're further away, we can see more of the land, so the density of those rocks should be higher. So we can turn this number up here to add a few more. If I turn this off, then we're no longer highlighting them, and we can play with the seed just to get different rocks in different places. And it's always worth doing that, because some will make a more pleasing image than others. It doesn't always look good if you've got a rock just there. Now, it's perfectly possible to create an area that won't have rocks, but I don't necessarily actually quite like those up there. So that's got our basic rock distribution. Now we need to put some light in the scene. So first of all, let's go to the shader editor and go to world and just say use nodes. And then we're going to add texture, which is an environment texture. Connect that into the background. We'll say open, and we'll use an HDRI texture. I ended up using something like this, just some clouds, and we'll have a look at what that looks like. So if I come out of narrow camera view, you can see we've just got some HDRI clouds. Now I decided to add more light than just the clouds would provide, but that's a starting point. Now that's a blue sky, but it will probably change later on, and we can certainly change the colour of the background if we wanted to. What is worth doing though is being able to control where any particular part of the sky is. It's very bland at the moment, we can barely see the clouds at all. So we'll add under vector a mapping node, connect that into there, and we'll add an input which is a texture coordinate node, and we'll just take generated and put that into there. And then we can play around with the rotation for Z, and there you go. You can see as I move this around, we get different parts of the sky displayed, and the brightest part of the HDRI is illuminating different parts of the scene. So you can see how that's working there. So that's okay. We've got a bit of cloud now, which makes it a bit more interesting. I think I'll see about lowering my camera angle a little bit. Perhaps shift it this way slightly and move it in. That rock's quite an interesting one just there. Obviously we've got no proper textures on the land or the rocks at the moment. It's just very plain textures, but it's okay. And if we want to, we can even play with the lens size in the camera. If you do that, things get much smaller, and this makes them much bigger. Playing around with this will affect parallax in the scene. You need to try it out and see how that's working. So we'll go with that for now. And then what I'll do is I'll put a lamp in the scene. So we'll put a light which is a sun lamp. It doesn't really matter where it is in the scene, but it's good to have some indication of what it looks like and where it is. So relatively low in the sky, and let's see how that's affecting it at the moment. See, we're starting to get some shadows and some highlights now. So I made my sun slightly yellow, mostly because of the idea of dust and what have you in the atmosphere. I used quite a high strength of 5. See, that's made a difference. Now the angle in theory should be very small, but because I'm representing dust in the air, that actually may increase the angle. I ended up with 1 degree, which softens the shadows and things like that. If I show you what I'm doing over here, I'm just going to move it over to here because of what I'm trying to do with the sun. There, now the sun is slightly behind the camera effectively, even though the object appears to be in front of the camera. And we'll make it a more shallow angle, thing like that. I want to have some shadows in the scene, and then we can play around with the direction of the sun like this. I quite like that we've got some highlights there, some shadows there, shadows in the rocks and so on. If we wanted very soft shadows, we'd put this angle right up here, and you can see they become very soft indeed. We'll come back to 2 degrees, I think, for the moment. So now we'll go back to the shader editor and we'll go for object. We'll select our landscape, turn off the highlighting, and we'll start putting something a bit more interesting on that. So I'm going to add favorite node, under textures, a noise texture, and I'm going to add under converter a color ramp. Take the factor into the color ramp, and for the moment I'm just going to drag that color over to here, and then we'll drag the color over to this side as well, so they've both got the same color, but I'll just make that side quite a bit darker. I'll lighten that side up, then I'll just take that into the base color and we'll look from above. So if I narrow these points together, you can see that's the sort of scale of noise that we've got there. If I went up something like 53, now I haven't unwrapped this, and because it's essentially a plane, that's pretty easy to do. Make sure everything's selected when you're in edit mode, press U and just say unwrap. I put the detail up, and you just need to play with the scale really to get a level that works for you. And if you need to, under input you can put texture coordinate. UV is what we're currently using, as you can see, and that's sort of sorted out that slight waviness to it. We're not going to see the variations quite like this frequency that I'm using, so I put that down about 40 now. But what I then did, just move that one over here, is add a couple more points, and you can give them a bit of variation. And I used B-spline as well, so that's a more gentle variation. I just wanted some variation in colour for the landscape, so it wasn't all one simple colour. Perhaps I'll even turn that down a little further. Looking above, you can see there are some changes in the colour of the landscape. It's not just a block of colour. Next, I'm going to add another texture, which is a wave texture. I'm going to just disconnect that and put in my wave texture there. Again, we'll look from above. I decided to use diagonal. You can see it's starting to do some interesting things. I tried various different options here, but the best one, triangle was one I went with for a while, but the best one is really sine. For this effect, I put the scale up quite a bit. You can pump in the UV coordinates if you want to, but they will be very linear if you do that. Or you could use something like generated, which is essentially what it's doing now. So I used quite a high scale. The idea was to try and simulate the ripples in the surface of a dune, maybe too high. And then I added distortion. So you can see what that starts to do is just break the lines up a bit. Put the detail up as well. Then you just need to find the right level of distortion. Just makes it a little more natural. So I'm not actually going to use that color. I'll put my color back in. What I am going to use it for is I'm going to add under vector a bump node, which makes it essentially render what appears to be geometry that isn't really there. I'm going to take that texture that I created, that wave texture, put that into the height, and then the output of that goes into the normal input on the shader node. And you can see we started to get sort of lumps in the surface, but they're a bit extreme at the moment, so we need to take the strength back quite a long way. And I also turned the detail scale up. I've just gone for a more linear look there. So you just need to play around with it to get the effect that you want. It's a subtle effect. And then just to add a bit more, I'm going to add another noise texture over here, and I'm going to add under converters a math node, connect the factor to the math node, set that to multiply, and I'll set this to 0.1 for the moment. Connect the output into displacement. You can see this now starts to give us more variation in the surface, and we can add a little distortion if we want to, and more roughness too if we want to. So again, that just adds a little bit more surface, some more texture to the surface, just to make it a bit more interesting. One last thing, just to make that texture a little more interesting, is I'll add another noise texture, and I'll add under color mix RGB node. Set it to multiply and take each of those noise textures into there and the output into my bump node. So it's effectively multiplying one by the other. I left it about 0.5, and I can turn the scale of this noise up a little bit as well. And I think I'll turn the detail down slightly on that one. So all of these different noise textures, just giving some literal texture to the landscape. And I need to do something to that distant landscape. So I'm going to take this set of nodes and just paste them into there. Just copied and pasted, drop that into the distant landscape. Don't really need that multiply node for this one, but everything else is pretty much the same. You may want to play with scale a little bit. Also, I haven't unwrapped that distant one, so I'll do that now. And we're going to need to put that scale up quite a bit, I think. And you see I've decided to use the generated for the wave texture for that distant one. And obviously we'll turn the strength down quite a bit and the scale up a little bit as well, which makes it smaller essentially. And finally, we decided to make it a little darker. So under color, I put a brightness contrast node in. I dropped the contrast a little, not too much, and dropped the brightness ever so slightly. We'll go for minus 0.05, see how that looks. That's the landscape done. Next up is the texture on the rocks. So the rocks seem to have a sort of bluey, blackish texture to them. So let's put a few nodes on. To begin with, I'm going to add under input texture coordinate node, and then I'm going to add under texture a noise texture, and I'll use the generated output into the vector of the noise texture. I'm going to start with the settings I used previously, but you very often find you need to tweak them every time you remake an image. So we'll go with 55 for the noise scale, 15 for the detail, and I just put the roughness up a little bit, about 600 and something. No distortion at the moment. I'm going to add under converter color ramp, take the factor of the noise into that. I'm just going to flip the color ramp, and then on the low side, I'm actually going to put quite a dark brown sort of color. And on the high side, the only reason I flipped it was just to save me one click really in darkening But what I did with this side, almost black, but there's just a little bit of blue in it. So it's a bluish black. And then bring those closer in together here. I'm going to add color mix node. I'm going to set that to screen. That color goes into one side, and on the other side, quite a dark blue. This is just, it's not essential, but this is just how I achieved the particular look of rock that I had. And then the output of that goes into the base color on the rock. So you see they're a sort of purplish color at the moment. I didn't want them to be that color all over. We may need to change it again yet anyway. So I'm now going to add under converter another color ramp, and under input a layer weight node. So layer weight is a node that essentially gathers information about the angle that the light bounced off the object before it hit the camera. So if it's bouncing off from over here, bouncing off the edge and hitting the camera from a very shallow angle, that gives a different output compared to light that's bounced off almost from behind the camera, hit the object and come back to the camera. So I'm going to use facing output. These are sort of complementary to each other. That's connected into the color ramp, and then the color ramp output is connecting into that screen, so it's controlling the mix. If I take that away, all the way one way we get the sort of browny color here, and all the way the other way we get the purpley blue color. So this is controlling how we see that. And then the degree I adjusted here, so I went for 0.9. If I go all the way up, the whole rock's that color. And I then started to turn this down, and so that we didn't get quite so much of that purpley color, I actually set this to a sort of greyish color. So you can now see we're starting to get areas of the rock which are just giving that strange sort of purpley color, but without the whole rock doing it. And I used B-spline, so it's a more gentle fall off. So just where it's a shallow bounce, we're just getting that look. So that's good for the color. We're going to need more color ramps, so I'm going to copy that one twice. I'm going to take that noise texture. So the idea obviously of the noise texture is to also give some variation between the different colors. It's all just having layers of interest really. This color ramp, the lower end I'm going to put about there, and I'm going to set to a fairly light grey. The other one I'm going to put about middle, and a slightly darker grey, perhaps not quite that dark. This one we're going to have black on that side, white on the other side for the moment. I've accidentally set that to transparent, so there we go. Zoom in on a rock, take my noise into those two. By the way, if you hold the shift key down and then use the right mouse button, you can tile those together. It just makes it a bit easier when you're detaching and reconnecting things. So this one is going to control the roughness of our rock. So you can see the rock's fairly evenly shiny at the moment. So that output is going to go into the roughness input here. So I can now play with this, and it will use the noise to determine what parts of the rock are shiny and what parts aren't. So the lighter this output, the less shiny the rock is, the more rough it is. So you get a larger specular reflection. If this was black, it would be going all the way to very, very shiny indeed. So we'd have really, you can see they almost look wet there. And that's why I took it up from black, so it didn't quite get to that stage. And then I'm going to add under vector another bump node, take the output of that color ramp into the height, and that goes into the normal. So this is now using the same noise texture, but to give us some surface texture, some surface bumps. This one I set to B-spline to make them a little bit more gentle, and the strength up down to about 0.5, maybe even less than that. You can see they now look like there's some detail in those surfaces. And once you've got that detail, then you can play around even more and just how much it changes. So obviously the idea is that there'll be some high bumps on here, the high spots, which may be shinier than the low spots. And we can play with this to determine how much of that sort of purple cast we get. But we'll go with that for now. It gives this idea of ancient rocks. So having done the rocks, we're now ready to add the mist. So I'm going to add a mesh, which is a cube, and we'll just drop that over our landscape and size it up. I think I ended up enclosing even the remote landscape. It's not that important, as long as it encloses all of the landscape that you have. It doesn't, however, need to be all that high. You don't really want to see corners and things like that. The camera's now inside that box, mist or dust, whatever you want to call it. So we go to rendered view, and at the moment it's black because there's no light getting in. So we'll give the object a new material, and we'll remove the principal shader. So what I'm going to add now is, under shaders, a volume scatter node. This is the most important one. You can use the volume absorption node as well. You want to emphasize shadows and so on, but volume scatter node is generally going to be enough. Make sure that goes into the volume input. And we'll just change the name of that cube to dust. Blender got confused a bit there for a moment. Now currently the density is 1, so it's not really letting any light through. So let's put the density down to a very low value, 0.01. Now we're getting light. And you can see, if I zoom in, there is actually a mist effect in the scene. Things are getting paler as they go off into the distance. And that's fine, but of course I want to simulate a dust that has a slight colour. I'm going to turn it up to max brightness and I'm going to put a slight pinky orange sort of colour on there. It's not immediately obvious, but it just changes the colour of the light that's coming through slightly. But I don't want it just to be like a fog, a mist. I want there to be some variations. We need a few more nodes yet. But first of all, I'm going to add texture coordinate node. We're using a lot of these today. And I'm going to add under vector a mapping node. This will become more important when we want to do some animation. And I'm just going to take the generated output and put that into there and not change anything else at the moment. I'm now going to add another favorite node, which is the noise texture, and we'll connect that into here. I'm going to set the scale to about 65, detail at 15, and because this is simulating things moving in air, they will often have little curls and things like that in them. So I'm going to add some distortion. I'm going to add under converter a color ramp node, connect the noise texture into that, set it to B-spline, and I'm just going to narrow these points in. This sort of increases the contrast between black and white that's coming out of our noise texture. And then I'm going to add a math node, set that to multiply, take the output of the color ramp into there and set this to 0.025. This is really just to scale what's come out of here because we want relatively low density noise, because otherwise we won't be able to see anything, but we can play with it in a minute. And then take that into the density of our volume scatter node. So if I increase this number, you can see it gets a lot foggier. And if I set this to, for example, cardinal, so for this particular scene, looks like I need some noise texture that's much lower value. So I've gone to cardinal just so that it highlights what's going on with the noise in the scene. So you can see we've got patches of noise in various places. One of the other things we need to make sure, by the way, is that our camera isn't clipping. So let's just turn this up to 1000 for the clip end point. I'm also going to then, under render properties, come to light paths, and I'm just going to put volumetric up a couple of points because that will make it much more visible. So if you wanted a mist that's rather mist or dust like that, then you can do it that way. But here's one of the funny things that you may find. You may find you need to adjust the color of that mist quite a bit. So for example, you can see I'm getting purple in the sky now with a green dust, but down here it's showing as green. So it's quite interesting how it works. As you come towards the center where there's less color, it will have less of a color effect, as it were. I'll go back to B-spline now, as that seems a sort of reasonable frequency, and we'll turn the density back down again because we're not trying to simulate a sandstorm. If I give that a render, we can see what that looks like. So we'll just go 128 samples. We'll leave denoising off for the moment, but I will turn caustics off because we don't need them for a scene like this, and they do add noise. I've already increased volume. I'm going to go up one more, I think. So let's give that a render and see what it looks like. Okay, so that's not too bad. Probably need some tweaking to increase the contrast on that dust in the air slightly. And it's very difficult to really see how that dust is working until you finally do the render. So I'll just cover a couple of things about animating the dust and about doing a render for a scene like this. So I haven't denoised this scene. So it's something you will want to do. And in the past, denoising hasn't worked that well with volumetrics. It still has its limitations, but for something like this, it should work okay. So one of the first things you need to do is you can just denoise here, but I prefer to manage it myself. I'm going to come down to just 32 samples now, which is no better than the preview frame that I had up. Go to advanced, make sure you click this because you're going to get a certain amount of noise in the scene. And what this will do is help avoid the sort of screen door effect where the same noise pattern is occurring on multiple frames if you're doing an animation. That's quite important. As I say, the more you increase this, the more light bounces within the volumetrics you'll get, but it will slow the render as well. So I'm actually going to drop that by one. Now come to the render passes. So that's under view layer properties and turn on denoising data. We come up here now and we go to the compositor and say use nodes. You can see we've got some denoising outputs now. So we can add under filter denoise node. So we can just take the image into there. We can take the denoising normal into there and the denoising albedo into there. And then the output just goes into here. There's no denoising data at the moment, even though it's having a go, so it won't work. But we'll give that another render without changing anything else. And you can see we've got a much smoother image now. And for this effect, that level of denoising works absolutely fine. So having done that, how do you animate your volumetrics? Well, in essence, it's pretty straightforward. We go back to the shader editor and we've already put the nodes in that we need. But what I found was you can't really assess whether the wind, as it were, is moving at an appropriate speed with the viewport and looking at still images. You really need to see an animation. So what I ended up doing, I ultimately made an animation of about 500 frames, but to just test out how things were working on the animated volumetrics, I limited the start and end frame to about 100 frames and then rendered them, just rendered the animation and then had a look to see how that looked. If I'm going for say 500 frame animation again, then at frame 0, hover over location and press I, and I also hovered over scale. Strictly, you could change the scale of the noise here as well, of course. In fact, I set the noise to about 0.95, so I was changing the overall scale of the noise. That means not only was the noise pattern moving from one side of the screen to the other, but the pattern itself was changing because of the way that the noise generator works. So not just getting bigger or larger, but actually changing. So that set it to 0.95 here and 0 there. Then I went to the end of the animation and you can see these boxes are green now. And for me, I just moved it in X, 0.25 of a meter, press I hovering over that section and set the scale to 1, I over that. With that box selected, you want to just click down here and say interpolation mode linear for both of them. Make sure that they're both linear, otherwise it won't seem to do anything to start with. The wind speed will speed up in the middle and then it'll slow down again at the end. So unless that's the effect that you want to do that. So 1/4 of a meter was plenty and it was still a relatively fast wind for me. You'll see the full animation at the end, and if you look carefully you should be able to see the effect of the wind. So I hope you enjoyed those tutorials. I will upload the original file for my Patreon supporters to use. Don't forget to click like and subscribe, otherwise I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.